The cold rain lashed against the sleek glass of the towering skyscraper as Michael Thompson adjusted the collar of his tailored trench coat and stepped into the damp chaos of the New York City night. The rhythmic hum of car horns and splashes of water filled the air, a cacophony of city life he had long since tuned out. Yet, tonight, the weight of it felt heavier than usual, pressing down on him as he walked the crowded streets. Michael's mind swirled with thoughts of the past week. The accusations from board members, the sharp decline in his company's stock, and the echo of his fiancée's words as she walked out of his life for good. "You care about nothing but your own success," she had said, her tone colder than the rain now soaking through his shoes. Lost in thought, Michael almost missed her. A small figure huddled against the corner of a building, half hidden by the shadow of a flickering street lamp. The woman sat on a frayed blanket, her shoulders hunched against the rain, a paper coffee cup clutched in trembling hands. Something about her caught his eye. Maybe it was the way her eyes flickered up at him as he passed, or the fact that, unlike others in her situation, she didn't extend her cup toward him. She sat there, seemingly resigned, her expression guarded yet defiant. Michael hesitated, an odd pang of guilt stirring in his chest. He had walked these streets for years, passing countless faces like hers, but this time he stopped. Maybe it was the gnawing emptiness he'd been feeling lately, or perhaps he was just tired of pretending not to care. "You shouldn't be out here in this weather," he said, his voice unintentionally brusque as he approached her. She looked up, startled. Her brown eyes, sharp and intelligent despite the weariness etched on her face, met his. She didn't speak at first, just stared, as though trying to determine whether he was serious or mocking her. "I don't have much choice, do I?" she finally replied, her voice low but steady. Michael frowned, glancing at the soggy cardboard sign propped against the wall beside her. It read, "Just trying to get back on my feet. Simple, unadorned, and utterly without pretense." "What's your name?" he asked, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "Abby," she said, shifting uncomfortably under his scrutiny. "Abigail Carter." "Abby," he repeated, almost to himself. He straightened and pulled his wallet from his coat pocket, flipping through the bills without much thought. Her expression tightened at the sight of his money, a flicker of pride flashing in her tired eyes. "I'm not asking for charity," she said firmly, her voice sharp enough to stop his hand mid-motion. Michael paused, surprised by her tone. He slid the wallet back into his coat. "I wasn't offering charity," he said after a moment, an idea forming in his mind. "I was offering an opportunity." Abby's brow furrowed. "What kind of opportunity?" "I need a temporary secretary," Michael said, surprising even himself with the words. "My assistant's been overworked lately, and there's always more paperwork piling up than anyone can handle." She stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief. "You're joking." "I'm not," he replied. "You don't have to decide now, but if you're interested, meet me at the Thompson Enterprises building tomorrow morning. 9 sharp. He reached into his coat again, this time pulling out a sleek business card. Abby took it hesitantly, her fingers brushing against the embossed letters. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost suspicious. Michael hesitated. How could he explain the gnawing emptiness he felt, the strange urge to do something, anything, that might fill the void? Instead, he simply said, "Everyone deserves a second chance." Abby studied him for a long moment, her gaze unreadable. Finally, she gave a small nod. "I'll think about it," she said, tucking the card into the pocket of her damp jacket. Michael nodded and turned to leave, the sound of the rain swallowing his footsteps. He didn't look back, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Behind him, Abby sat clutching the business card, her mind racing. She had every reason to doubt his intentions. People like him didn't just help people like her. But there had been something in his eyes, something genuine. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope, however cautious. As the rain continued to fall, washing the grime of the city into the gutters, both of them were unaware that this small act of kindness would set their lives on a collision course neither could have anticipated. Abby stood in the expansive lobby of Thompson Enterprises, clutching her worn backpack as she took in the scene. The polished marble floors gleamed under the bright lights, and the air smelled faintly of expensive coffee and freshly printed paper. Around her, employees in tailored suits moved with purpose, their clipped heels echoing in sharp contrast to her hesitant steps. She felt like an intruder. Michael appeared beside her, his stride confident and brisk. "This way," he said, motioning for her to follow. She trailed behind, feeling every pair of eyes that lingered on her too-long coat and scuffed boots. They entered an elevator, and Michael pressed the button for the top floor. The walls, lined with mirrors, only heightened her discomfort. Abby avoided her reflection, instead focusing on the floor numbers ticking upward. As they stepped into the executive suite, a sharp voice greeted them. Mr. Thompson, Claire Reynolds, Michael's assistant, approached, a stack of papers in hand. She was impeccably dressed in a navy blazer and pencil skirt, her sharp eyes flicking to Abby. "Claire, this is Abigail Carter," Michael said. "She'll be helping out temporarily." Claire's smile was polite but thin, her skepticism poorly masked. "Temporary, I see." Abby's grip on her backpack tightened, but she said nothing, meeting Claire's gaze evenly. Michael's voice cut through the tension. "Show her to the second desk in my office. She can start by organizing the backlog of correspondence." Claire hesitated, clearly surprised, but nodded. "Of course." As Claire led Abby to her workspace, the hum of office life surrounded them. Phones rang, keyboards clacked, and muffled conversations created a symphony of controlled chaos. Abby couldn't help but notice the subtle glances thrown her way. Curious, skeptical, some outright dismissive. "This is it," Claire said as they arrived at a small, neatly arranged desk just outside Michael's office. Her tone was cordial, but her words carried a sharp edge. "You'll find the files over there. If you need anything, ask. But try not to bother Mr. Thompson unless absolutely necessary." "Understood," Abby replied, her voice steady despite the prick of Claire's condescension. Left alone, Abby took a deep breath and surveyed her new environment. The desk, with its clean lines and pristine computer, seemed a world away from the damp streets she had left behind. As she began sorting through the towering stack of papers, she couldn't help but marvel at the stark contrast. This was Michael's world, cold, precise, and detached. It was nothing like the chaotic, unforgiving streets she had called home. For now, she was an outsider, but something in her stirred. Maybe she didn't belong here, but she wouldn't let that stop her from trying. Michael sat at his desk, staring at the glowing city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. Behind him, the soft rustle of papers reminded him that Abby was there, diligently working through the mountain of files he'd assigned her. He glanced over his shoulder. Abby was hunched over a stack of correspondence, her brow furrowed in concentration. She hadn't spoken much since arriving, responding to his occasional instructions with a nod or a quiet "got it." Her silence unnerved him more than he cared to admit. "You're remarkably focused," Michael said, breaking the quiet. Abby looked up, surprised by the comment. "There's a lot to get through," she replied simply, her tone neutral. Michael leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Most people would be overwhelmed by a task like this. I've dealt with worse," Abby said, her voice soft but steady. Her gaze met his briefly before returning to the papers in front of her. Her response piqued Michael's curiosity, but he decided against pressing her further. Instead, he changed the subject. "If you need anything, coffee, a break, let me know." "Thank you, but I'm fine," she said, a small but polite smile tugging at her lips. Michael hesitated. It wasn't like him to make small talk with employees, but something about Abby made him want to keep the conversation going. Perhaps it was the calm confidence in her demeanor or the way she seemed to approach even the most tedious tasks with purpose. "Why did you take the job?" he asked abruptly. Abby paused, her pen hovering over the page. She seemed to weigh her words before responding. "Because I needed it, and because you offered." Her straightforwardness caught Michael off guard. He nodded, unsure of how to respond. Meanwhile, outside the office, Claire Reynolds stood near the break room, her phone in hand. Her sharp eyes were fixed on a screen as she scrolled through search results. "Abigail Carter," she muttered under her breath, tapping on a link. The name brought up a handful of scattered articles. Nothing too specific, but enough to pique her interest. One headline caught her attention. Local family business crumbles after corporate acquisition. Claire frowned, her instincts telling her there was more to Abby than she was letting on. With a determined expression, she saved the article to revisit later, already formulating a plan to uncover the truth. Back in the office, Abby resumed her work, unaware of Claire's suspicions or the subtle shift in Michael's view of her. For both, first impressions were only the beginning. The soft glow of the office lamp illuminated Abby's desk as she worked through yet another stack of documents. Hours had passed, but the quiet hum of the office made it easy to lose track of time. Each file told a story, transactions, memos, contracts, and she treated them with the same meticulous care, absorbing details with practiced precision. Halfway through the pile, a pattern began to emerge. Abby frowned, leaning closer to the papers. Certain entries seemed off, dates that didn't match up, figures that felt inflated, and repeated references to obscure vendors she didn't recognize. At first, she dismissed it as a clerical error. But as the discrepancies continued to appear, a nagging feeling settled in her chest. These weren't random mistakes. They were deliberate. She glanced toward Michael's office, where the door was ajar. Through the crack, she could see him, leaning back in his chair with his hand on his temple, deep in thought. He looked exhausted, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair and his tie slightly loosened. Abby hesitated. She wasn't sure if this was something she should bring up. After all, she was just a temporary employee, a nobody in the grand scheme of his company. If she was wrong, she risked looking like an overreaching fool. Still, the numbers gnawed at her, refusing to be ignored. "Something on your mind?" Michael's voice startled her. She looked up to find him standing by her desk, holding a coffee mug. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said quickly, gathering the papers in front of her as if to hide them. "You didn't." He raised an eyebrow, glancing at the stack of files. "You look like you found something interesting." Abby hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edges of the papers. "I noticed a few things," she began carefully. "Some entries in the records don't seem to align. I thought maybe it was just an oversight." But her voice trailed off, unsure how much to reveal. Michael studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Show me." Reluctantly, Abby handed him the file, pointing out the irregularities she'd flagged. As he skimmed the documents, his brow furrowed. "These are older records," he said, almost to himself. "I'll have to take a closer look." "Good catch, Abby." She nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of relief and uncertainty. Michael's reaction wasn't dismissive, but it wasn't entirely reassuring either. As he walked back to his office, file in hand, Abby couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something far bigger than she realized. Michael placed the file Abby had flagged on his desk with a deliberate thud. The office lights cast sharp shadows across the room, emphasizing the tension that hung between them. Abby stood across from him, her arms crossed defensively, but her posture betrayed a quiet determination. "Care to explain how you noticed this?" Michael asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. Abby hesitated, her gaze flitting between the papers and Michael. "It's not that complicated," she began, choosing her words carefully. "The numbers didn't add up. Repeated vendor names, inflated amounts. It stood out." "Stood out," Michael repeated, leaning forward. "These records go back years. Even my senior accountants haven't flagged these issues. Yet here you are, a secretary, catching discrepancies in days." There was an edge to his words, but Abby didn't flinch. "I'm not just a secretary," she said evenly. Michael raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. Abby took a deep breath, her hands tightening at her sides. "I studied finance," she admitted, "before everything fell apart. Numbers have always made sense to me. It's like reading between the lines. And this isn't just sloppy bookkeeping. Someone's hiding something." Her words hung in the air, sharp and direct. Michael narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing her. "Finance?" he repeated, intrigued. "Where?" "NYU," she said, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. Before my family lost everything, Michael leaned back in his chair, sensing the raw emotion behind her words. What happened? Abby hesitated, her mind flashing back to the day her world collapsed. She could still hear her father's voice, strained with desperation, as he tried to save their family business. The cold efficiency of corporate lawyers dismantling everything they had built. The headlines that followed. Local business suffers in hostile takeover. It doesn't matter, Abby said finally, her tone clipped. The point is, I know how these things work. And I'm telling you, there's something in those records you don't see. Michael regarded her in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he stood and crossed his arms. If what you're saying is true, I'll need more than vague suspicions. Can you dig deeper? Abby blinked, surprised by the question. You're asking for my help? Michael nodded. You've already seen what my team hasn't. I want to know what else you can uncover. Abby hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Okay, I'll help. As Michael returned to his desk, Abby felt the weight of her decision settle over her. Whatever secrets were buried in those files, she was determined to find them and face the consequences. Michael leaned over Abby's desk, watching as she scrolled through rows of financial data. The tension of their earlier conversations had softened, replaced by a quiet focus on the task at hand. The soft hum of the computer filled the room as Abby's fingers danced over the keyboard. This entry here, she said, pointing to a particularly dense report. It doesn't match the invoice dates in the ledger. The payment was processed 6 months before the supposed contract approval. That's not just unusual, it's deliberate. Michael frowned, leaning closer to examine the screen. He hated to admit it, but Abby's ability to spot these details was remarkable. How can you be sure? Patterns, Abby replied without hesitation. Whoever did this left a trail. They just didn't expect anyone to look for it. Michael straightened, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. You sound like you've done this before. Abby hesitated, but didn't meet his gaze. Not exactly like this. But numbers don't lie. People do. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Michael found himself looking at Abby with newfound respect. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he impulsively hired her, but it wasn't this. Someone who could challenge him, someone whose insights were sharper than most of his seasoned staff. Keep going, he said simply, stepping back to give her space. As they worked, the initial awkwardness between them began to fade. Michael found himself asking Abby's opinion more frequently, and her responses were consistently insightful, if occasionally blunt. Meanwhile, outside the office, Claire Reynolds watched from her desk with a growing sense of unease. She had always been fiercely loyal to Michael, but Abby's sudden arrival felt like an intrusion. Curiosity had gotten the better of her. A quick search into Abigail Carter's name had yielded just enough breadcrumbs to make Claire suspicious. A once promising finance student from NYU, linked to a family business that had gone under after a major corporate acquisition. The pieces fit too neatly to be coincidence. Claire tapped her pen against her desk, her thoughts racing. She considered confronting Michael with the information but hesitated. What if revealing Abby's past backfired? Michael seemed oddly invested in her, and Claire wasn't sure how he'd react. Back in the office, Abby and Michael reached a stopping point for the night. Abby stood, stretching her stiff shoulders as Michael collected the papers they had been reviewing. You've got a good eye for this, Michael said, almost grudgingly. Abby smirked faintly. Thanks. Coming from you, I'll take that as high praise. Michael chuckled softly, a rare sound that caught Abby off guard. Don't let it go to your head. For a moment, the atmosphere felt almost light. The weight of their work temporarily lifted. But as Abby gathered her things, she couldn't shake the feeling that their progress had only scratched the surface of something much larger. As Michael walked her to the elevator, he glanced at her with a thoughtful expression. Abby, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Whatever this turns out to be, thanks for stepping up. Abby paused, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. Don't thank me yet, she replied. We still don't know how deep this goes. The elevator doors closed, leaving Michael alone in the quiet hallway. He couldn't help but wonder what Abby's story really was, and why it mattered to him so much. Nearby, Claire watched the scene unfold, her suspicions deepening. She resolved to dig deeper into Abby's past. Whatever the truth was, she would find it, and ensure Michael knew exactly who he had let into his company. The office was unusually still, its usual buzz replaced by the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of papers. The city lights poured through the windows, painting soft patterns across the walls. Abby sat at her desk, her head bent over a stack of reports, while Michael leaned against the edge of his desk, a coffee mug in hand. It was late, far later than either of them should have been there, but neither made any move to leave. The quiet felt oddly comforting, a reprieve from the intensity of their work. "Long night," Michael remarked, his voice low. Abby looked up, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You could say that." Michael gestured to her desk. "You don't have to stay this late, you know, and leave you to figure all this out on your own?" Abby teased, her tone light but her eyes serious. "I don't think so." Michael chuckled softly, taking a sip of his coffee. "I'm starting to think you're more stubborn than I am." "Probably," Abby replied, setting her pen down. "But stubbornness has its uses." A comfortable silence settled between them before Michael spoke again, his tone quieter this time. "Can I ask you something?" Abby glanced at him, wary but curious. "Depends on the question." Michael hesitated, as though weighing his words. "What happened to your family's business? You mentioned it before, but you didn't go into detail." Abby's expression faltered, her hands folding in her lap. She looked away, her gaze falling on the cityscape beyond the window. "It was complicated," she began, her voice tinged with a sadness she couldn't entirely hide. "My father owned a small manufacturing company. It wasn't anything huge, but it was ours. We worked hard to keep it running, and it meant everything to him." Her voice caught slightly, but she pressed on. "Then one day, a big corporation came in with an offer. My father didn't want to sell, but they pushed until he didn't have a choice. After that, it was just a matter of time before everything fell apart." Michael listened in silence, his brow furrowing as her words sank in. He saw the pain in her expression, the weight of a loss she still carried. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice soft. "That sounds unfair?" Abby finished for him, her smile bitter. "Yeah, it was." For a moment, the air between them felt heavy, filled with the unspoken grief of past failures. Then Abby looked at him, her eyes searching his. "But you probably know how these things work, don't you?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he set his mug down and crossed his arms, his gaze distant. "I do," he admitted. "And I've been on the other side of it more times than I care to admit." The honesty in his voice surprised Abby. She watched him carefully, noting the faint crease in his brow, the tension in his jaw. For all his confidence and composure, there was something profoundly lonely about him. "You don't seem proud of it," she said gently. "I'm not," Michael replied, his tone almost a whisper. The quiet stretched again, but this time, it felt different, less like silence and more like understanding. Abby reached for her mug, her fingers brushing his as she picked it up. The contact was brief, but it lingered in the way they both paused, neither acknowledging it aloud. "You're not who I expected you to be," Abby said softly, her gaze meeting his. Michael smiled faintly. "Neither are you." They stayed like that for a moment longer, the quiet evening wrapping around them like a fragile cocoon. For the first time, neither felt entirely alone. Victor Hayes leaned back in his leather chair, a sly smile playing on his lips as he scanned the report. The name Abigail Carter stood out, along with her connection to Michael Thompson. "Interesting," he muttered, tapping the paper with a finger. His assistant stood nearby, hesitant. "Should we look into her further?" the assistant asked. Victor nodded slowly. "Yes, dig deeper. I want everything, her past, her connections, her weaknesses. If Thompson thinks he can keep secrets, he's mistaken." In Michael's office, Abby's growing presence in the company had not gone unnoticed. Whispers followed her through the hallways, hushed voices questioning why someone like her had been brought in. It didn't take long for the skepticism to harden into open hostility. "Can you believe she's actually working here?" one employee muttered to another near the break room. "Michael must be losing it," the other replied. "Bringing in someone like her. No degree, no experience. She's probably just a charity case. Abby overheard the exchange as she walked by, clutching a folder close to her chest. She kept her head high, but their words stung. Later that day, the tension reached a boiling point when Claire entered Michael's office. She carried a folder in her hand and a look of quiet determination on her face. "Michael, we need to talk," she said, her tone firm. Michael glanced up from his desk, setting aside a stack of papers. "About what?" "Abigail Carter," Claire said bluntly. She placed the folder on his desk and opened it, revealing a printout of articles and records. "I did some research. She's not who she says she is." Michael's expression darkened, but he gestured for her to continue. "She's linked to a family business that went under after a corporate acquisition," Claire explained. "She's hiding her past, and I think you need to reconsider trusting her." Michael leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Claire, I appreciate your concern, but Abby hasn't given me a reason to doubt her. If anything, she's proven to be one of the most capable people here." "But—" "No," Michael said firmly. "Let her do her job. That's all that matters right now." Claire frowned but didn't argue further. As she left the office, her unease only deepened. Meanwhile, Abby had been working tirelessly to sift through the tangled web of records. Late that evening, she found herself in the archives, surrounded by stacks of old files. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed above her as she flipped through yet another ledger. Then, she saw it. A series of payments funneled through an obscure vendor, one whose name appeared repeatedly in the discrepancies she'd flagged. Abby's heart quickened as she traced the transactions, each one more suspicious than the last. Her fingers hovered over her notes, connecting the dots. Whoever had orchestrated this had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks, but they hadn't expected someone to dig this deep. "Got you," she whispered to herself. She hurried to Michael's office, where he was still working. Bursting in, she placed the folder on his desk. "I found something," she said, her voice breathless. Michael looked up, surprised by her sudden entrance. He opened the folder and scanned its contents, his eyes narrowing as he read. "This vendor," Abby explained, pointing to a highlighted entry. "It's a shell company. The payments were funneled through them to disguise embezzlement. Whoever set this up has been siphoning money for years." Michael's jaw tightened as he absorbed the information. "Victor Hayes," he said under his breath, his tone icy. Abby blinked. "You think he's behind this?" Michael nodded grimly. "It fits his style. Subtle, manipulative, and devastating if left unchecked." Abby hesitated, her voice softening. "What do we do now?" Michael closed the folder, his expression resolute. "We keep digging. If Victor's behind this, we need proof, solid proof." For the first time in days, Abby felt a glimmer of hope. Despite the growing tension, they were making progress. As she left the office that night, the weight of the day's events lingered, but so did the determination to see it through. Unbeknownst to her, Victor Hayes was already setting his plans into motion, determined to dismantle her progress before she got too close to the truth. Abby sat at her desk, the faint glow of her computer screen illuminating her face. She had been going through another batch of documents, following the trail of the shell company she and Michael had uncovered. Her focus was sharp, each piece of data fitting together like a puzzle. But then, she saw it. A familiar name buried in an old acquisition report. Her heart stopped as she clicked on the file, her eyes scanning the lines of text. There it was, in black and white, Thompson Enterprises. The words blurred as Abby's mind raced. She read the report again, slower this time, confirming what she already knew. Michael's company had orchestrated the hostile takeover of her family's business. For a moment, she couldn't move. Memories flooded back, the shouting matches between her parents as they tried to save the company, the look of defeat on her father's face when they lost everything, and the years of struggling to rebuild their lives. Her hand clenched into a fist, the paper crumpling beneath her grip. She couldn't believe it. The very man she had started to trust, who had given her this opportunity, was part of the reason her family had fallen apart. Without thinking, Abby stormed into Michael's office. He looked up, startled by her sudden entrance. "Abby?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "What's wrong?" She didn't sit down. Instead, she slammed the report onto his desk. "Explain this," she said, her voice trembling with anger. Michael frowned, picking up the paper. As he read it, his expression darkened. "Where did you find this?" "Don't deflect," Abby snapped. "Just tell me the truth. Did you know? Did you know your company destroyed mine?" Michael set the paper down and sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Abby, I didn't." "Don't lie to me," she interrupted, her voice rising. "You want me to believe you didn't know what your company was doing? That you weren't involved in tearing apart small businesses for profit?" Michael stood, his expression grim. "I didn't know it was your family's business," he said, his voice steady but low. "I didn't know about you." "That doesn't make it any better," Abby shot back, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You still did it. You let it happen. My father worked his entire life to build that company, and you destroyed it like it was nothing." Michael's shoulders sagged, guilt washing over him. "I was younger then," he admitted. "Ambitious. I didn't question the deals. I trusted my team to handle the acquisitions, and I didn't think about the people behind them." Abby's jaw tightened, her voice cracking. "Well, congratulations. You didn't think, and now my family is ruined. My father, he never recovered from it. And my mother," she trailed off, shaking her head. Michael stepped closer, his expression softening. "Abby, I'm sorry. If I could undo it, I would." She took a step back, her hands trembling. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Michael. Sorry doesn't bring back what we lost." Michael looked at her, his guilt evident, but he didn't know what else to say. He had spent years trying to climb to the top, and now the consequences of his ambition were staring him in the face. "I gave you this job because I saw potential in you," he said quietly, "not because I knew about your past." "I swear, Abby, I didn't know." Abby crossed her arms, her gaze hard. "Then why did you hire me? Out of pity? Guilt?" Michael hesitated. "No," he said finally. "I hired you because I saw something in you. You're smart, driven, and you deserve a chance. But I won't deny that I've made mistakes. Mistakes I'll have to live with." The room fell silent, the weight of their conversation pressing down on both of them. Abby turned toward the door, her voice bitter. "You should have thought about the people behind your decisions before it was too late." As she walked out, Michael sank into his chair, the paper still on his desk. He stared at it, the names and numbers swimming before his eyes. The cracks in his carefully built world had never felt more visible. Alone in the elevator, Abby felt a mix of emotions boiling inside her. Anger, betrayal, sadness. They all swirled together, leaving her raw and unsteady. She leaned against the cold metal wall, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to quit, to walk away and leave Michael to deal with the mess he had created. But another part of her, the part that had agreed to take this job in the first place, refused to back down. If there was any chance of exposing the corruption in his company, she wasn't going to let it slip away. By the time the elevator doors opened, she had made up her mind. She would stay, but she wasn't doing it for Michael. She was doing it for her family. Michael sat in the silence of his office, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. Abby's words echoed in his mind, each one striking deeper than he'd expected. He had thought himself untouchable, immune to the fallout of his past actions. But now, confronted with the very real consequences of his ambition, he realized how blind he had been. The weight of his mistakes pressed down on him, heavier than ever before. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but for the first time, he wanted to try. Abby's decision to return to work the following morning surprised even her. She had spent most of the night debating whether she could face Michael, or herself, after what she had discovered. The memory of their confrontation still lingered, but something deeper compelled her to stay. Walking away would mean letting the people who wronged her family win again, and she wasn't about to let that happen. When she entered the office, the usual hum of activity fell quiet. Employees paused, their conversations halting mid-sentence as Abby passed by. She could feel the weight of their stares, hear the faint whispers that trailed behind her. "She's the one stirring things up, isn't she? Why does Michael keep her around?" Abby squared her shoulders, ignoring the judgmental glances. She wasn't here for them. Inside his office, Michael sat at his desk, his expression heavy as she entered. He looked up, startled to see her. "Abby," he said cautiously, standing as if unsure how to greet her. "You came back." "I'm not here for you," she said plainly, setting her bag down by her desk. "I'm here because there's more to uncover, and I'm not finished." Michael nodded slowly. He didn't expect forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever. But her resolve gave him a glimmer of hope. "Then let's get to work." The tension between them was palpable throughout the day. Their conversations were brief and strictly professional, every word calculated to avoid any hint of personal connection. Despite this, Michael found himself watching Abby more closely than usual. Her sharp focus and unwavering determination only reinforced the guilt he already felt. By lunchtime, the murmurs in the office had grown louder. Abby had become the focal point of gossip, with accusations ranging from incompetence to manipulation. Claire's subtle jabs hadn't helped either, as she quietly fueled the skepticism of others. The tipping point came during a department meeting later that afternoon. Victor Hayes had sent a low-level associate to observe, an obvious attempt to rattle Michael. As the meeting progressed, the associate made a cutting remark about Abby's background, his tone dripping with disdain. "I'm curious," he said, feigning innocence. "What exactly qualifies someone like Miss Carter to be involved in matters this critical?" The room fell silent. Abby's face remained impassive, but Michael saw the tension in her posture, the slight tightening of her jaw. "That's enough," Michael said sharply, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. He rose from his seat, his gaze fixed on the associate. "Abby's qualifications are not up for debate. She's here because she's proven herself more capable than most." The associate shifted uncomfortably under Michael's stare, but managed a weak attempt at a smile. "Of course, Mr. Thompson. I didn't mean to imply otherwise." "You did," Michael said, his tone icy. "And if you're finished implying, I suggest you leave." The associate mumbled an apology and left the room. Michael turned to the rest of the team, his voice firm. "If anyone else has concerns about Abby's involvement, they can bring them directly to me. Otherwise, get back to work." Abby remained silent as the meeting resumed, but a flicker of something, gratitude, perhaps, passed over her face. Later that evening, as the office emptied out, Michael found Abby still at her desk, poring over the documents they'd been working on. He hesitated at the doorway before stepping inside. "You didn't have to defend me," Abby said without looking up. Michael leaned against the doorframe. "Yes, I did." Abby finally glanced up, her expression unreadable. "Why?" Michael took a deep breath, considering his words carefully. "Because you deserve to be here. You've worked harder than anyone else, and you've done more for this investigation in weeks than most people do in months. They don't see that, but I do." Abby's gaze softened, but she quickly looked away. "It doesn't change anything," she said quietly. "What your company did to my family." "I know," Michael said, his voice low, "and I don't expect it to. But for what it's worth, I'm trying to make things right." Abby met his eyes, searching for any hint of insincerity. She found none. Before she could respond, the shrill ring of Michael's phone cut through the moment. He frowned as he answered, his expression darkening with each passing second. "Victor," he muttered under his breath when the call ended. "He's making moves." "What kind of moves?" Abby asked, her tone sharp. "Leaking information to investors, planting doubt about the company's stability," Michael explained. "He's trying to shake the foundation before we can expose him." Abby's mind raced. "Then we need to move faster. If we can tie him directly to the shell company, it won't matter what rumors he spreads." Michael nodded, his jaw set. "Agreed. But it's going to get messy." Abby's lips curved into a faint, determined smile. "I've handled messy before." That night, as they worked side by side, the tension between them began to ease. Their shared focus on the investigation provided a fragile truce, a reminder that despite their differences, they were fighting for the same goal. For Michael, the experience was humbling. Abby's strength and resilience had forced him to confront parts of himself he'd long ignored. For Abby, Michael's willingness to defend her, publicly and without hesitation, planted the smallest seed of trust, though she wasn't ready to admit it. As the clock struck midnight, Michael glanced at Abby, who was still immersed in her work. "You should get some rest," he said. "So should you," she replied without looking up. Michael chuckled softly, shaking his head. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of something unfamiliar, a sense of purpose beyond himself. And for the first time, Abby began to wonder if redemption was possible for someone like Michael Thompson. The boardroom was a battlefield dressed in polished wood and glass. The long table gleamed under the fluorescent lights, surrounded by a dozen sharp-eyed executives who had gathered at Victor Hayes's insistence. Tension crackled in the air like an invisible storm as Abby sat quietly near the corner, her files meticulously organized but her heart pounding. Victor Hayes, standing at the head of the table, radiated confidence. He looked every bit the seasoned corporate player as he addressed the room with feigned gravitas. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor began, "I've called this meeting to address the troubling irregularities in our financial records. As you know, our company's reputation relies on transparency and integrity. Unfortunately, it seems we've failed in that regard." His gaze shifted to Abby, a sharp smile curling at the corners of his mouth. These discrepancies surfaced shortly after an unvetted individual was brought into the company. Abigail Carter, a temporary hire without proper credentials, has been given access to sensitive financial data. Murmurs rippled around the table. Abby felt their eyes on her, some filled with doubt, others with outright suspicion. She straightened her posture, clutching the file in her lap tighter. Victor continued, his voice calm but cutting. "It's clear that the mishandling of these records coincides with her arrival. I must question whether this individual has acted irresponsibly, or worse, maliciously." Michael's expression darkened, his hands resting on the table as he leaned forward. "That's enough, Victor," he said, his voice low but commanding. Victor raised a brow, his tone dripping with mock innocence. "I'm merely presenting the facts, Michael. Surely you can't deny that Miss Carter's involvement raises questions." Michael stood, his voice firm. "What raises questions is your sudden interest in transparency. Let's not pretend this is about protecting the company. It's about deflecting blame." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Michael turned to Abby and gave her a small nod. Abby rose, clutching her folder tightly as she stepped forward. Her palms were sweaty, her heart pounding in her chest, but she met the eyes of the board members with unwavering determination. "I understand the concerns," Abby began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "But Victor Hayes isn't pointing fingers because he's concerned about this company. He's doing it to cover his own tracks." Gasps echoed around the table, but Abby pressed on, opening her file. She spread out the documents she had meticulously gathered, pointing to key entries. "These records show a series of payments funneled through a shell company tied directly to Victor," Abby explained. "The discrepancies aren't mistakes, they're deliberate. Funds have been siphoned from this company for years under the guise of legitimate expenses." Victor's confident demeanor wavered, his eyes narrowing. "That's a bold accusation, Miss Carter," he said, his tone sharp. "Do you have any proof?" Abby held her ground, pulling out another document. "This is a contract signed by Victor Hayes authorizing payments to the shell company. The signature matches his exactly. Additionally, I traced the ownership of the shell company. It's registered under an alias linked to Victor." The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping as board members pored over the evidence. Victor's composure cracked further, his jaw tightening as he attempted to interject. "Enough." Michael's voice boomed, silencing the room. He stepped beside Abby, his expression resolute. "I've made mistakes," Michael admitted, addressing the board. "I've turned a blind eye to deals I should have questioned, and that's on me. But this, what Victor has done, isn't just a mistake. It's calculated fraud, and it's cost this company and its people more than we can measure." Victor scoffed, his mask of calm slipping entirely. "This is absurd. You're really going to trust her over me? A nobody from the streets?" Abby felt a pang of anger at his words, but refused to let them shake her. Michael, however, stepped forward, his voice cold. "Abby Carter has proven herself more trustworthy in weeks than you have in your entire career, Victor," Michael said. "And the evidence speaks for itself." Victor's expression hardened, and for a moment, he said nothing. Then, as the board members murmured in agreement, he abruptly stood. "This is a witch hunt," he snapped, gathering his briefcase. "You'll regret this, Thompson." Victor strode toward the door, but before he could leave, two uniformed officers entered the room. The room stilled as the officers approached Victor. "Victor Hayes," one of them said, his voice firm. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of embezzlement and corporate fraud. Please come with us." Victor froze, his face going pale. He turned to Michael, his eyes filled with venom. "This isn't over." He spat before the officers escorted him out. The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of what had just transpired settling over everyone. Then, one of the board members cleared his throat. "Well," he said, glancing at the documents in front of him, "it seems we owe Miss Carter and Mr. Thompson a great deal of thanks." Michael nodded, but his gaze shifted to Abby. She looked exhausted but resolute, her shoulders relaxing slightly as the tension began to ease. As the board members filed out, Michael turned to her. "You were incredible in there," he said, his voice sincere. Abby shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I just did what needed to be done." Michael nodded, his respect for her growing. "You did more than that. You exposed the truth and saved this company." For the first time in what felt like forever, Abby felt a glimmer of pride. She had faced her fears, stood her ground, and uncovered the truth. But as she looked at Michael, she realized their journey wasn't over. There were still scars to heal and trust to rebuild. For now, though, they had one. The boardroom was quiet the next morning, but the atmosphere was heavy. Michael stood at the head of the table, his usually confident demeanor tempered by a gravity that silenced even the most outspoken board members. Abby sat at the far end, a quiet but steady presence, her files meticulously arranged in front of her. "I've asked for this meeting," Michael began, his voice firm but not without emotion, "to address my role in what has transpired over the years at this company." The room shifted uneasily as Michael's words hung in the air. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the faces of those who had both supported and questioned him over the years. "I won't deny it. I've made mistakes. For too long, I prioritized ambition over integrity. I allowed myself to ignore the finer details of deals, the impact of acquisitions, and the human cost of our growth. That ends today." There was a ripple of murmurs, but Michael pressed on. "Effective immediately, I will be stepping down as CEO of Thompson Enterprises. This company needs leadership that values transparency and ethics above all else. It's the only way to rebuild what has been damaged." The room fell silent. Even those who had privately questioned Michael's judgment were stunned by his announcement. Abby watched him closely, her expression unreadable, but her heart unexpectedly heavy. One of the senior board members cleared his throat. "Michael, are you sure about this? You've led this company for years, and it's time for someone else to lead." Michael interrupted, his tone resolute. "This isn't about me. It's about the company and the people we've affected." The board exchanged uncertain glances, but no one argued further. Abby's hands tightened around her pen as she realized the depth of Michael's decision. He wasn't just taking responsibility, he was actively dismantling the very pedestal he'd built his life upon. Later that afternoon, Abby found herself in the smaller, more modest conference room, meeting with the legal team and a handful of key stakeholders. She had spent the better part of the week drafting a plan to restructure the company's practices, ensuring transparency and accountability moving forward. This proposal outlined steps to identify and dissolve shell companies linked to fraudulent activity, Abby explained, pointing to the charts on the screen. "We'll also establish an independent oversight committee to review all major acquisitions." The stakeholders nodded, impressed by her thoroughness and clarity. One of them, an older man with a sharp gaze, leaned forward. "You've done remarkable work here, Miss Carter. But are you certain these reforms will prevent future misconduct?" Abby met his gaze without hesitation. "No system is perfect, but these changes are designed to create multiple checks and balances. It's about creating a culture where accountability is the norm, not the exception." The room murmured in agreement, and Abby exhaled quietly. For the first time, she felt like she was finally making a difference, not just for herself, but for the countless others who had been hurt by unchecked ambition. By evening, the office was nearly empty. Abby sat at her desk, reviewing the final notes from the day's meetings. The hum of the city outside provided a quiet backdrop, but she barely noticed it. Her focus was broken by a soft knock on the doorframe. Michael stood there, his tie loosened and his posture more relaxed than usual. "Got a minute?" he asked. Abby nodded, setting her notes aside. "Of course." He stepped inside, taking a seat across from her desk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything that had happened in recent weeks seemed to settle in the silence between them. "I meant what I said today," Michael began, his voice quieter now. "Stepping down, it's the right thing to do. But that doesn't make it easy." Abby studied him, noting the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "It's never easy to face the consequences of your choices," she said, her tone gentler than she expected. "But it's the first step toward fixing what's broken." Michael nodded, his gaze dropping to the papers on her desk. "You've done an incredible job, Abby. Not just with the investigation, but with everything. The reforms you're pushing for, they're exactly what this company needs." Abby hesitated, unsure how to respond. Finally, she said, "I couldn't have done it without your support." Michael gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "Support? You've been doing most of the heavy lifting. I just tried not to get in your way." Abby's lips quirked into a faint smile. "That's a start." They fell into a comfortable silence, the weight of the day easing slightly as they sat together. Michael leaned back, his gaze drifting to the city skyline visible through the window. "You know," he said after a moment, "when I first hired you, I thought I was doing you a favor. But now, I realize you were the one helping me." Abby tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" "You've shown me things I didn't want to see," Michael admitted. "About myself, about the company, about the way we've been operating. It's humbling, to say the least." Abby considered his words, then said quietly, "Humility isn't a bad thing. It's what makes change possible." Michael turned to her, his expression serious. "And you? Do you think this company can change?" Abby hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but it's going to take time, and people who are willing to fight for it." Michael's gaze softened. "People like you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Abby allowed herself a moment of pride. "Maybe," she said, her tone light but genuine. As the evening stretched on, the two of them sat in quiet conversation, the tension of the past weeks giving way to something quieter and more profound. They weren't just two people bound by circumstance anymore. They were allies, working towards something greater than themselves. And for both of them, that was a start. The first day of Claire Reynolds' tenure as CEO of Thompson Enterprises began with a quiet determination. She stood in front of the board, outlining her vision for the company's future. A future shaped by the ethical reforms Abby had meticulously planned. "These changes won't be easy," Claire said, her voice clear and steady. "But they're necessary if we want to restore trust and rebuild the reputation of this company. It's time we prioritize integrity over profit." The board nodded in agreement. Claire had always been a capable leader, but now, with Abby's influence woven into her plans, she had a roadmap for meaningful change. Meanwhile, Abby was saying her quiet goodbyes to the office she had helped transform. Her desk was cleared, the files she had pored over for weeks now resting in Claire's capable hands. "You're really leaving?" Claire asked as she passed by, pausing in the doorway of Abby's now empty office. Abby smiled, a mix of relief and hope in her expression. "I've done what I needed to hear. It's time to focus on something new." Claire nodded, extending a hand. "Thank you, Abby, for everything. This company wouldn't have a future without you." Abby shook her hand, feeling a rare sense of closure. "Take care of it, Claire. Make sure the changes stick." As she walked out of the building for the last time, Abby felt the weight of her past lift slightly. She wasn't leaving with bitterness, but with purpose. 2 weeks later, Abby sat in the modest office of her newly established consultancy. The walls were bare, the furniture simple, but it was hers. On the desk in front of her sat a file for her first client, a struggling local business on the brink of collapse. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "How's the new venture going?" Abby smiled, typing a quick reply. Terrifying, but exciting. Exactly how it should be. Michael's response came seconds later. That's how I felt starting out too. You'll do great. She set the phone down, her thoughts drifting to Michael. In the weeks since his resignation, he had begun to carve out a quieter, simpler life. No longer tied to the constant demands of his former role, he had started exploring what he truly valued: time for reflection, reconnecting with old friends, and slowly, tentatively, building something meaningful with Abby. One evening, Michael arrived at Abby's new office, carrying a bag of takeout. "Thought you might need a break," he said with a smile as he set the food on her desk. Abby laughed, shaking her head. "You really can't resist micromanaging, can you?" Michael chuckled. "Old habits die hard. But seriously, I just wanted to see how you're doing." Abby gestured around the room.
"It's not much yet, but it's a start."
"It's more than that," Michael said, his tone sincere. "You're giving people like you, like your family, a chance to fight back."
"That's huge."
Abby's smile softened. "I guess I learned from the best. Or maybe the most persistent." They sat together, eating and talking about their plans. Abby's growing consultancy, Michael's new hobbies, and the possibility of what lay ahead for them. For the first time in a long while, their conversation wasn't about the past or the burdens they carried. It was about the future. And for both of them, that was a new beginning worth embracing. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of Abby's new office, casting warm, golden hues across the bare walls. The space smelled faintly of fresh paint, and a single potted plant sat in the corner, a gift from one of her first clients. Abby stood in the middle of the room, holding a screwdriver as she eyed the sign that leaned against the wall. Carter Consulting, it read, bold black letters etched on a simple white background. The sight of it made her chest tighten with a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Michael standing there, a faint smile on his face and a small box in his hands. "Need a hand?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. Abby grinned, setting the screwdriver down. "I thought you were busy reinventing yourself." Michael shrugged, placing the box on her desk. "Turns out reinventing myself doesn't take all day. Besides, I couldn't miss this." She arched an eyebrow. "Miss what?" "Your official opening," he said, nodding toward the sign. Abby's expression softened as she crossed her arms, leaning against the desk. "I haven't even hung it up yet." "That's where I come in," Michael said, picking up the screwdriver. "I figured I owed you at least one favor." Abby rolled her eyes, but couldn't help the small laugh that escaped. "Be my guest." As Michael set to work, the room fell into a comfortable silence. Abby watched him, noting how different he seemed. The edges of his usual intensity had softened, replaced by a calm focus. He was still Michael, but there was something freer about him now, as though shedding the weight of his past had allowed him to truly breathe. When the sign was finally in place, Michael stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans. "There. Perfect." Abby studied the sign, her chest swelling with quiet pride. "It is." Michael turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Abby." "So have you," she replied, meeting his gaze. He hesitated, then stepped closer. "I owe you an apology. For everything. For what my company did to your family. For the part one played in it, even if I didn't fully understand it at the time." Abby shook her head. "We've been over this. You've already done more than enough to make up for it." "It doesn't erase the past," Michael said quietly. "But I've learned that forgiveness isn't about erasing anything. It's about finding a way to move forward." Abby's throat tightened as she looked at him. "I've spent so much time being angry. At the world, at the people who took everything from us. But somewhere along the way, I realized that holding on to that anger was only hurting me." Michael nodded. "So where does that leave us?" Abby smiled faintly. "Right here. Starting over. Taking the next step." He returned her smile, his voice soft. "You're braver than you give yourself credit for." Abby felt a warmth rise in her chest, her usual guardedness giving way to something more vulnerable. "You've changed too, you know. You're not the same man I met that night in the rain." Michael chuckled. "And you're not the same woman who sat in the corner of my office, terrified to speak up." The air between them grew still, charged with an unspoken understanding. Abby reached out, her hand brushing against his. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael tilted his head, his eyes searching hers. "For what?" "For believing in me," Abby replied. "For giving me a chance, even if it wasn't perfect." Michael's lips quirked into a small smile. "You gave me a chance to, Abby. Maybe we both needed one." They stood there for a moment, the quiet enveloping them like a cocoon. Then Michael reached into the box he'd brought, pulling out a small frame. "What's that?" Abby asked, curious. Michael handed it to her, his smile widening. Inside the frame was a simple quote. "Sometimes, the smallest steps lead to the greatest transformations." Abby stared at it, her throat tightening again. "You remembered. How could I forget?" Michael said softly. Abby looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "It's perfect." As she placed the frame on her desk, Michael stepped back, his gaze lingering on her. "So, what's next for Carter Consulting?" Abby laughed, the sound light and unburdened. "One step at a time, Michael. One step at a time." And as they stood together in the modest office, the future ahead of them felt vast and full of possibility, proof that even the smallest steps could lead to something extraordinary.